Now it's time to finally start using prototypes. And after this, you will feel like a real pro developer, believe me. And we're going to continue with the example from the previous video. Okay, but now we're going to talk about prototypes. So actually, we talked about prototypes, prototypal inheritance, and delegation earlier already. But how does all of that actually work? Well, it can be summarized like this. So first, each and every function in JavaScript automatically has a property called prototype. And that includes, of course, constructor functions. Now, every object that's created by a certain constructor function will get access to all the methods and properties that we define on the constructor's prototype property. So just to visualize, in our case, this would be person dot prototype. So the prototype property of the constructor function. So again, as I was just saying, all the objects that are created through this constructor function here will inherit, so they will get access to all the methods and properties that are defined on this prototype property. And so let's now actually add a method to this prototype property. And so this is actually an object. And so we can now say calc h. And then we can simply set it to this same function here. So equal. And that's it. Now we get some error here. And that's because I misspelled prototype. So that's type right here. And let's actually take a look at this prototype property just for curiosity. So that's not comma, of course, it's the dot. And so here is that prototype property. And so you see that right now we already have the calc_h method in there. So before it was kind of an empty object. So never mind these two here. So basically it was empty before, but now there is the calc_h method already in here. So this one that we just defined down here. All right. And once again, remember how I said that each object created by this constructor function will now get access to all the methods of this prototype property. And so, of course, also to calc_h. And so we should be able to do this. So Jonas, which is this object here, which was, of course, created by this constructor function. And so calc_h. And let's see. And indeed, we get the correct h here. So it worked. Great. That's amazing. So we can now use this method here on the Jonas object, even though it is not really on the object itself, right? So if we check out Jonas here, then you see that it contains, of course, the birth year and the first name, but it does not contain the calc_h method. But still, we have access to it because of prototypal inheritance. Okay? And of course, the same is going to work for Matilda here, and of course, also for the Jack object. Beautiful. So that effectively solves this problem that we had before when we added the calc_h method directly to each of the objects. Remember that? So here we would have created a copy of this method here and attached it to every single object. And so that's why we don't do this. Instead, what we do is this, because now there exists only one copy of this function. So only one of them exists, but then all of the objects that are created using this constructor function can basically reuse this function on themselves. And so the this keyword, of course, in each of them is, as always, set to the object that is calling the method. And so here that's Jonas, and here that's going to be Matilda. So just like we learned previously, the this keyword is set to the object that is calling the method. Now, right, so in a nutshell, this is how we implement very basic prototypal inheritance in JavaScript in practice. So we just observed that the Jonas and the Matilda objects are kind of somehow connected to the person, right? That's why they can have access to these methods, or in this case, to just this method that is located inside the prototype property of person. But how and why does this actually work? Well, it works because any object always has access to the methods and properties from its prototype. And the prototype of Jonas and Matilda is person.prototype. And we can actually confirm that because each object has a special property called underscore underscore proto. So like this, underscore underscore proto, and then again underscore underscore. So this looks a bit weird, but this is just kind of how it works. So let's take a look. And so this is the prototype of Jonas. It's not the prototype property, but it is simply the prototype. Okay, and so here again, we see the calc_h function, and that's why Jonas is able to use this. So the prototype of the Jonas object is essentially the prototype property of the constructor function. So let's quickly see that as well. So we can check that. So person.prototype. And so this should now be true. And indeed it is. All right. But what I just said sounded incredibly confusing, didn't it? So shouldn't person.prototype be the prototype of person? I mean, should this prototype property here not be the prototype of person? Well, actually, no. So this is the confusing part. So person.prototype here is actually not the prototype of person, but instead it is what's going to be used as the prototype of all the objects that are created with the person constructor function. So that's a subtle but important difference that you need to keep in mind. And in fact, what I just said is confirmed by this comparison that we just did here. So we just saw that Jonas's prototype, which is this, is the prototype property of the person constructor function. And there are actually other built-in methods that we can use to prove this. So on any object, for example, object.prototype, we can test if this is a prototype of another object. So we can call is prototype. So is prototype like this of, and then Jonas. And so this should also become true. And indeed it is. So this confirms one more time that person.prototype is indeed the prototype of Jonas. And the same for Matilda, of course, as well. But person.prototype is not the prototype of person. So you see, it is false here. So this very common confusion comes from bad naming of this property. So the fact that it's called prototype kind of implies that this is the prototype of person. But as we just learned, it is actually not. Probably shouldn't be called prototype, but instead something like prototype of linked objects or something like this. So if this makes it easier, you can think of the prototype property as prototype of linked objects property, even though, of course, it's not called like this, but this would be a more honest name. So take some time to really understand what the prototype of what object actually is here. Now, anyway, where does this proto property here on the Jonas object actually come from? Well, remember the new operator that we talked about before? Well, it contains this step number 3, which links the empty new object to the prototype. And so basically, it is this step number 3 which will create this proto property. So it creates this proto property and it sets its value to the prototype property of the function that is being called. And so that's exactly what is written here, right? So again, it sets the proto property on the object to the prototype property of the constructor function. And so this is how JavaScript knows internally that the Jonas object is connected to person.prototype. And in fact, when we check out the Jonas object here, we can indeed also see that property in here. So it's also right here. And if we open that up, then you see exactly person.prototype, which contains this calc_h function. All right. So I'm spending a lot of time here for you to really understand what this proto property here is and what the prototype of the constructor is and how they are all linked, because this is one of the most important things and also one of the most difficult things to understand in JavaScript. But I hope that it's becoming increasingly clear, and there will also be a couple of diagrams in the next video that will basically bring all this knowledge together in an easier to understand way. So by now you're probably sick of hearing the word prototype, but I just wanted to quickly show you that we can also set properties on the prototype. And so not just methods. So let's say person.prototype.species. And so this is something that all of the objects here will have in common. And so that's Homo sapiens. All right. And so if we now take a look at Jonas and at Matilda also, then we should see this property, so the species, on both of them. And actually not directly here, but indeed they will be here in this prototype. And so we will be able to do Jonas.species and Matilda.species. And both of these objects will then inherit, so they will get access to this property from the prototype. So you see, in both cases, we indeed get Homo sapiens. Now, however, since when we take a look at these objects, well, as we just saw, this property is not really directly in the object. So it's not its own property. So own properties are only the ones that are declared directly on the object itself. So not including the inherited properties. And actually in JavaScript, there is a way of checking for that. So we can do Jonas has own property. So that's with a capital P here. And so let's first check for first name. And indeed, this object does have its own property with this name. But now if we try species, then that is going to be false. And again, that's because this property is not really inside of the Jonas object. It simply has access to it because of its prototype. So because it's in the prototype property of person. So right here. Right? And sometimes this method here can be quite helpful in certain situations. All right. And that is probably enough for one lecture. And as I just mentioned earlier, in the next video, I'm going to show you a nice diagram of all of this. So stay tuned for that one.